In March of 2020, the world stopped. A pandemic shut down factories, ports, and borders within weeks. And suddenly, the global supply chains that had functioned with clockwork precision for decades broke. There were no masks, no ventilators, no medicines, no microchips. And the world discovered, all at once, that it could not manufacture the things it needed most, because it depended on factories on the other side of the planet that were closed. The just-in-time system, manufacturing exactly what is needed at exactly the right moment to minimize inventory costs, became just too late. But the pandemic was not the beginning of this story. It was the moment when a trend already underway became visible to everyone. From the trade war between the United States and China that began in 2018, to the sanctions on Russia in 2022, to the new industrial policy laws in the United States and Europe, the world seems to be pulling in the opposite direction from globalization. Are we witnessing the end of globalization? Or merely its transformation? We have reached the final episode of this season. We have traced the history of trade from ancient routes to the supply chains of the 21st century. We have seen the benefits and the costs, the winners and the losers, the institutions and their contradictions. Today we close with the question that defines the current moment: is the world fragmenting? We will examine the forces pushing toward deglobalization, the data that nuance it, and the possible implications for the future. In January of 2018, President Donald Trump imposed tariffs of 30% on imported solar panels and 20% on washing machines. That was just the beginning. In the following months, the United States imposed tariffs on more than 60% of imports from China, most at 25%. China responded with similar tariffs on American products. The escalation was rapid and furious. The trade war between the United States and China was not a passing outburst. It continued under the Biden administration, which maintained most of Trump's tariffs and added new ones, especially on advanced technology and semiconductors. The motivations were multiple. Economic: the U.S. trade deficit with China exceeded $300 billion annually. Technological: concern that China was stealing intellectual property and illegally subsidizing its companies. And geopolitical: the perception that economic interdependence with China was a strategic vulnerability, not a strength. The tariffs had a stated objective: force China to change its trade practices. But they also had an unstated one: begin decoupling the economies of the two superpowers. The effect was significant but complex. U.S. imports of Chinese products subject to tariffs fell 14% between 2017 and 2022. But total imports from China did not fall as much, because importers found ways around the tariffs. And imports from Vietnam, Mexico, and India grew in exactly the same products where China was losing market share, suggesting that some trade was simply rerouted, not eliminated. The trade war questioned dependence on China. The pandemic questioned dependence on everyone. When Chinese factories closed in February of 2020, automobile production lines in Europe stopped for lack of components. Hospitals around the world ran out of protective equipment because production was concentrated in a few countries. The microchip crisis was especially revealing. The majority of the world's advanced chips are manufactured in a single country, Taiwan, and by a single company, TSMC. When demand for electronics soared during the pandemic while production was disrupted, the shortage spread throughout the global economy. Car factories shut down for months over 50-cent chips. The global supply chain system had been designed to maximize efficiency. But efficiency and resilience are opposing objectives. An efficient system concentrates production where it is cheapest. A resilient system distributes it to reduce risks. The world had furiously optimized for efficiency and had ignored resilience. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The Western response was unprecedented, the broadest and most aggressive economic sanctions ever imposed on an economy the size of Russia's. $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves were frozen. Russia's major banks were disconnected from SWIFT, the financial messaging system that handles the vast majority of international payments. Technology exports to Russia were banned. Russian oil imports were embargoed by the European Union. The ruble plunged 30%. The Russian central bank doubled interest rates to 20%. Russia's credit rating was downgraded to junk. The sanctions on Russia demonstrated something many had already suspected: global economic interconnection could be used as a weapon. If you depend on financial systems, technologies, or markets controlled by your geopolitical adversaries, that dependence is a vulnerability. Russia responded by seeking alternatives. It redirected its energy exports toward China and India. It integrated into the Chinese payment system, CIPS. It strengthened ties with economies not participating in the sanctions. And the message came through loud and clear to other countries: dependence on the Western financial system carries risks. China, in particular, took note. It accelerated the development of alternative financial systems. It reduced its exposure to the dollar. It strengthened its technological self-sufficiency. The sanctions on Russia were effective in many respects. But they also accelerated the fragmentation of the global economic system into blocks. Perhaps the most significant change is ideological. For 40 years, the economic orthodoxy in Washington, London, and Brussels was that government should not interfere in resource allocation. Markets decided where things were made. Free trade determined who produced what. Industrial policy was a dirty word. That has changed radically. In 2022, the United States passed the CHIPS and Science Act, which allocated $52 billion in subsidies to build semiconductor factories on American soil. That same year, the Inflation Reduction Act allocated hundreds of billions in clean energy subsidies, with local content requirements that favored production in the United States. The European Union responded with its own package of industrial subsidies. Japan, South Korea, India, all launched similar programs. The logic was simple: we cannot depend on a single country for the chips our cars, hospitals, and defense systems need. We need to make things here. It is Alexander Hamilton's argument, updated for the 21st century. It is not classic protectionism, not about putting up tariffs to protect inefficient industries. It is strategic industrial policy, using public money to ensure that certain critical sectors have domestic production capacity. Supporters say it is common sense: nobody wants to depend on a geopolitical adversary for essential products. Critics say it is the beginning of a protectionist spiral: if everyone subsidizes everything, nobody wins. So, is the world deglobalizing? The data are ambiguous. Global trade in goods hit historic highs in 2022. U.S. imports were 40% above pre-pandemic levels. The value of global trade remains enormous. But the composition is changing. Trade between geopolitical blocs is growing more slowly than trade within blocs. Chinese imports into the United States have fallen from 22% to 17% of the total, while imports from Vietnam and Mexico have grown. Companies are talking about reshoring, bringing production back home, nearshoring, moving it to nearby countries, and friendshoring, moving it to allied countries. In practice, total decoupling between the United States and China remains more rhetoric than reality. Indirect connections through third countries remain strong. And actual reshoring, bringing factories back, remains limited. What we are seeing may not be deglobalization but selective fragmentation. The world is not returning to the protectionism of the 30s. But it is also not going back to the naive hyperglobalization of the 2000s. We are in new territory, a world where trade remains massive but where national security, resilience, and geopolitics matter as much as economic efficiency. For ordinary people, these changes have direct consequences. If supply chains shorten and production returns to rich countries, some industrial jobs could come back. But products will be more expensive, because producing in Europe or the United States costs more than in Vietnam or Bangladesh. Consumers with fewer resources will be the most affected by those higher prices. If geopolitical blocs harden, countries caught in the middle, those that do not clearly belong to any bloc, could suffer. And the poorest countries, which depend on access to global markets for their development, could lose the main mechanism that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. For workers in rich countries who lost their jobs to hyperglobalization, deglobalization could bring relief. For workers in poor countries who found employment thanks to globalization, it could bring the opposite. There is no answer that benefits everyone. That is the constant lesson of this entire season. International trade always has winners and losers. What changes is who they are. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the trade war between the United States and China, the pandemic, and the sanctions on Russia have accelerated a trend toward the fragmentation of global trade. Efficiency is no longer the only criterion. Resilience and national security compete with it. Second, industrial policy has returned with force. The CHIPS Act, European subsidies, and similar programs around the world mark the end of the total free market orthodoxy. Governments are once again intervening in resource allocation, especially in strategic sectors. Third, total deglobalization is unlikely. The data show that world trade remains massive. But its structure is changing, from global chains to regional blocs, from pure efficiency to a balance between efficiency and security. What is dying is not globalization but the naive hyperglobalization that assumed more interconnection is always better. Throughout this season we have traced the history of trade from the Silk Road caravans to the tariffs of the 21st century. We have seen how trade connected civilizations, created wealth, generated suffering, and transformed the world. But behind every policy decision, every tariff, every trade agreement, behind every choice to open borders or close them, there is an idea. An economic theory. A way of understanding how the world works. In the next season, we are going to meet the thinkers whose ideas shaped everything we have told. From Adam Smith to Keynes, from Marx to Friedman. The schools of economic thought. The ideas that changed the world. That, next time.